All right, let's get started. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Before we do get into the nitty gritty of tonight's webinar, how corporations are cashing in on carbon pipelines, I do want to run through a few quick things. For those of you that I haven't met, I'm Emma Schmidt, and I'm a senior organizer for Food and Water Watch based in Northwest Iowa. And I'm going to be honest with you, I have pneumonia right now. So I'm really hoping tonight's webinar goes off without a hitch because it very well could be my last. No, I'm kidding. I already decided that I was going to die from spontaneous human combustion. So I am not too worried about this illness. That said, I am willing my body to avoid any coughing fits for the next hour. But if I do fail that mission, please accept my apologies in advance. Now, that part's on me, but we also have my lovely colleague John on here running the tech side of things. So if anything goes wrong with the tech, that is all on him. And when I say all on him, I mean it. If the Yellowstone supervolcano decides to erupt in the next hour or so and destroy all of our access to an internet connection, that's on John. So no pressure, John. Now, there's also one final thing that I need to discuss to keep this meeting on track, and that is a just truly marvelous invention known as the mute button. If you haven't heard of the mute button before, let me tell you, it is a beautiful thing. If you keep that mute button located at the bottom of your screen on, it allows you to go about your business without the rest of us having to hear a peep. Pretty cool, huh? You can watch this webinar while your 24 rescue dogs are howling at nothing, or while installing a new roof. I mean, it's a beautiful evening for such an activity, or during your weekly barbershop quartet practice. And the rest of us will not hear a thing. We'll just hear the presentation that we all came to see. So the takeaway here is to please try to keep yourself muted. Although, honestly, I would not be mad if a barbershop quartet did interrupt the agenda, because that probably would add some really sweet pizzazz to the event. But as long as we're discussing the agenda here, let's actually roll through it. Once I get done rattling on here, the first thing we'll do is we'll share some quick introductions, and then we'll briefly discuss the carbon projects that are happening across the Midwest to provide just a bit of an overview. From there, Food and Water Watch's policy director, Jim Walsh, is going to talk about some of the funding streams that are propping up carbon capture projects in the Midwest and across the country. We'll also briefly discuss the money that is being spent by massive corporations to influence policy and decision makers into supporting this carbon capture boondoggle. Finally, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to pop your answer or your questions into the chat at any point, and we'll be sure to get to them before we hop off tonight. So with all of that out of the way, if folks could please use the chat to introduce yourselves, you would truly make my dreams come true. Feel free to share your name, where you're from, and why you care about the influx of carbon pipelines being proposed for the Midwest. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share just a little bit about Food and Water Watch. So for those of you who might not know, Food and Water Watch is a national nonprofit with over 2 million supporters across the country. Our goal is to mobilize everyday people to build political power and push bold, uncompromised solutions to the most pressing issues, including the mass build-out of hazardous carbon pipelines. We run campaigns across the country to protect people from the corporations and other destructive economic interests that put profit ahead of everything else. We mobilize at the local, state, and federal levels to win the fights that others are even afraid to take on. We have fought against greedy corporations and reckless government agencies, and we've won time after time. We fight and we win in the courts, in the halls of Congress, and on the ground in every state. Corporations may have the money, but we believe that people have the power to make real change. And carbon capture and storage, or CCS, has been one of the issues that we've worked on for years, because we know it's just another way for Wall Street to profit while putting our communities, our livelihoods, and our futures at risk. So let's actually talk about the proposed carbon capture projects that are facing the Midwest. There are a handful of them, including large-scale projects proposed by Summit Carbon Solutions and Navigator CO2 Ventures that would each individually stretch for thousands of miles, along with projects that for now aren't quite as vast, like the 450-mile Tallgrass Trailblazer pipeline and the 300-mile carbon pipeline proposed by a Canadian-owned company known as Wolf Carbon Solutions. To get us all on the same page, I want to just quickly explain how these carbon capture pipelines would work. They are part of a bigger scheme known as carbon capture and storage, or CCS. So carbon capture and storage at the most basic level is a three-step process. First, carbon is captured from the smokestack of a polluting entity. In theory, you could capture carbon from just about any industrial source, but we're seeing these projects pop up in the Midwest largely due to the number of ethanol and fertilizer facilities that we have here. Ethanol operations emit a fairly pure form of carbon, so these carbon capture companies don't have to spend nearly as much money separating the carbon from the various other polluting gases that are emitted from the operation. And in the second step of the CCS project, the carbon dioxide is compressed and it's shipped off for storage. Since the carbon is meant to be stored in certain geological formations that will, in theory, keep the carbon from leaking back out of the ground, it has to be transported long distances through a series of pipelines. And then, the final step, the carbon dioxide is injected into the ground, typically into old salt caverns or nearly depleted oil and gas fields. Now, of course, that is not the only option. There's also the chance that the captured carbon could be used for enhanced oil recovery. Right now, of the 12 operating CCS facilities, 11 of them do just that. They pump the carbon into the ground to remove the very last dregs of oil from an almost empty oil field. And as Jim will tell you, they're making good money doing it. So all while the CCS industry is yammering on about how this technology is a solution to the climate crisis, they're supporting the very people that created the climate crisis in the first place. It's very clear that this isn't about being climate friendly or about being a green industry. The only green thing about any of these projects is the money that they're going to be raking in. And as long as we are debunking the lies the carbon capture industry is putting out there, let's talk about safety. The companies will tell you that carbon pipelines are entirely safe, right? Carbon dioxide makes up all sorts of things, from dry ice to soda pop. And that's supposed to make us believe that these pipelines are entirely harmless. But are they really? Well, I probably wouldn't have mentioned it as something to be debunked if that were the case. As you likely know, carbon dioxide is an odorless, colorless, invisible gas. If a pipeline were to rupture, that carbon would create an indistinguishable bubble that could asphyxiate everything, people and animals alike, in its reach. Modeling has shown that a carbon pipeline rupture could create a zone of lethal amounts of carbon stretching miles away from the rupture site, which of course that depends on the topography, the wind speed, weather, and all of that. But just the fact that it's possible is terrifying. It, to me at least, doesn't seem very harmless, right? And right now, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the federal agency that is in charge of the oversight of pipeline safety, is working to create new regulations around carbon pipelines to make sure that they are safe. But this process is going to take years. By the time that they're finished with it, most of the projects that we're currently facing are already going to be up and operational or nearly so. Carbon capture pipelines come with a variety of other concerns too. A key issue that crosses political lines is the abuse of eminent domain, the ability of private corporations to take our land, the land that is often used to support our livelihoods, compact, mix in, and irreparably damage the soil, all for their own private profit, ought to concern everyone. Our rights shouldn't be undermined so that wealthy CEOs can add a few more zeros to the end of their bank balance. And of course, these are just a few of the problems that come with carbon capture and storage, but I promised it was just going to be a quick, brief overview, and I am sticking to my word. So I am going to turn it over to Food and Water Watch's Policy Director, Jim Walsh, to talk us through the policies that have allowed carbon capture technology to become the boondoggle that it is. So take it away, Jim.
Hi, thank you so much, Emma, for that really great overview of what's going on. Folks can see that I have a mask on this evening. It's because I'm actually broadcasting here from Washington, D.C. And I just left a training that we're doing for a bunch of people who are here for a lobby day against the side deal, which I'll talk a little bit more about earlier, but a room full of 100 people that are about to go to a ton of meetings tomorrow in Congress to push back against all of the deregulatory efforts that are happening by the fossil fuel industry to fast track a variety of dirty energy projects, including carbon capture projects. And so I'm going to share my screen here with folks. Let me pull that up and then we'll get started. Let me start the slideshow. Great. So when I think about carbon capture and the literally billions of dollars in funding that the federal government is providing to this industry, really the only way that I could think about this is it's, really making this impossible, wasteful. Because we have done the carbon capture experiment and it has failed miserably. We have literally put billions of dollars of public money into carbon capture technology and it continues to fail. And really, when I think about what's the policy that enables us to go forward, it's really the money, because carbon capture is not financially viable and has been continuing to fail to the point where now we're actually really just defining working as, is it profitable? Not whether or not it's actually good for the planet, not whether or not it's good for communities, but whether or not people can make money capturing CO2. And the history of where the money comes from is a pretty long one. And it started off in 1984. And between 1984 and 1990, the federal government started funding clean coal programs. And so if folks remember clean coal, this carbon capture is clean coal. That is what they were talking about when they were talking about doing clean coal and how ridiculous that is. But what it does is it provides resources for this marketing campaign that the industry uses to convince people that, well, the only problem with our emissions or with our industry is the coal. And it pretends like the pipelines don't harm communities. It pretends like the emissions that aren't CO2 and greenhouse gases, it pretends like that doesn't hurt people. It pretends that the communities that are hurt by fracking and natural gas extraction aren't hurt by the continuation of these technologies. And so they put together $2.6 billion in funding for carbon capture projects. And then there was specifically a push for this Future Gen program, which is a collaboration between the federal government and coal companies to develop a demonstration project for carbon capture technology at a coal plant in Illinois. And then things were kind of quiet on the carbon capture front for a while. And then came really the creation of 45Q in 2008. And 45Q it's called 45Q because that's the section of the tax code that was created by this law that was passed, the Energy Improvement Extension Act of 2008, created 45Q in the US tax code. And what that did is it established a fee that the federal government would pay per ton of oil and gas production storage of CO2. And so if they were to store it for oil and gas production, which is enhanced oil recovery. So for folks who aren't familiar with this is literally taking captured CO2 and pumping it into the earth as a way to extract oil or gas that is otherwise unrecoverable. Because when you start when you start pumping wells, the pressure is far greater, and over time that pressure depletes. And so the industry uses CO2 to increase that pressure to squeeze out more oil or potentially gas out of wells. They use it for oil way more than they do gas production, but that can also be used in gas production. Or $20 a ton for geological storage. And that was the first time that we had what's called really a production tax credit for CO2. And production tax credits are tools that the federal government uses to encourage production of certain goods, services, or whatever. And so we have production tax credits for clean energy that encourage clean energy development. So this is a production tax credit to encourage CO2. And so it's very concerning that this is the model that was laid out and in that time, but a very relatively small amount of money to what we're seeing today. It established a 75 million ton cap on for CO2 that could be captured and actually claimed under that, to make sure that there was a ceiling on what the industry could claim, which has been changed since then. And we'll talk about some of those changes. There were efforts in 2018 and 2021, which really supercharged CCS funding. And this is all very recent. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 changed that 75 ton rule to a 12-year claim period, so that anybody who puts up these projects has 12 years that they can claim the benefit, but no cap on how much they can actually claim, just a cap on how many years they can actually claim it for. They also added direct air capture to the areas that could get credit for storage of CO2 or use of CO2 for oil and gas drilling. And that's the DAC, direct air capture, is added to this. And what they did is they said that, well, and they moved the relatively small $10 and $20 to $50 for geological storage by 2026, and it would increase that amount, and $35 for enhanced oil recovery by 2026. And so that was the first big increase that we saw in this. Didn't really see a major growth in the industry during that period of time. To date, we have 12 carbon capture facilities in the US. 11 of those facilities use the captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And then in 2021, actually it was 2020 in December, there was the Omnibus Appropriation Act of 2021, which is this big spending bill that passed near the holidays, essentially, like just before the Christmas holidays, where they allocated $6 billion for various fossil fuel infrastructure projects. And this is a variety of different, for pipelines, for industrial facilities to put CCS in there, but a bunch of different infrastructure investments for carbon capture. And then last year, you folks may have heard of this as the bipartisan infrastructure deal that passed last year, and it was supposed to be Senator Manchin gets a bipartisan bill to support the fossil fuel industry, and then progressives and people who care about the climate are supposed to get another infrastructure bill that helps to provide education funding, healthcare, and clean energy financing. That fell apart, but Congress did pass the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and that puts out $15 billion additional for carbon capture infrastructure in the country, pipelines, carbon capture in industrial facilities, and other subsidies for demonstration projects. And then also set aside $8 billion for hydrogen hubs. And so why am I talking about hydrogen hubs in the context of carbon capture? Because these hydrogen hubs are actually, in the hydrogen funding the federal government is giving out, explicitly finances and funds carbon capture being attached to hydrogen production. And so when we produce 95% of the hydrogen that's produced in the United States comes from methane. That's the gas we get from fracking. And they essentially crack that methane open, which is CH4, into carbon and hydrogen atoms. And that carbon forms with CO2, which is then can be captured by these hydrogen hubs. And then they have hydrogen. And so when we think about hydrogen, it's largely a new way to market fracked gas, but it also provides a benefit to companies for also capturing CO2 at these hydrogen hubs. And so that was laid out last year in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Also, towards the end of the year, just before Christmas, December, they like to do bad things during those periods of time because people are busy paying attention to their families and friends and getting together for the holidays. And this is when things like this will happen. Then this year, the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And the Inflation Reduction Act was largely championed by, and spoke about broadly by a number of organizations and a lot of elected officials as being a big victory for the climate. Well, there are some funding mechanisms in there for clean energy and electric vehicles, and there's issues with that we can talk about at another time. But the thing I want to talk about now is they actually super duper charged CCS funding for 45Q. And so those subsidies increased to $85 for geological storage for carbon capture and $50 per ton for enhanced oil recovery. whereas direct air capture saw increases of $180 for geological storage and $130 for EOR. And they also created a hydrogen tax credit that encourages carbon capture sequestration for hydrogen production, further enriching the benefits that the fossil fuel industry receives for producing hydrogen and for producing carbon dioxide that's warming our planet and has all the other negative emissions and problems that come from the fracking, the pipelines, and the downstream impacts of our communities. And what will these cost? Do you remember before I said there was a cap at 75 million tons, right? Of what could be, or 70 tons that could be captured. What we've seen is that these caps have been removed. And so there's a lot of questions about how much these actual new 45 subsidies will cost. Now, the one thing was when they passed this bill, it was supposed to be budget neutral and actually help reduce our deficit. And the Congressional Budget Office estimated that there would be $3.2 billion over 10 years would be the total cost of 45Q over this time period, estimating between 9 and 13 million tons of CO2 per year would be captured. The modeling done at Princeton by Repeat, which Senator Schumer and other members of the Senate who are championing this bill were holding up as showing that there were 40% reductions in CO2 by this plan. That modeling actually predicted about 200 million tons of CO2 per year, or about 75 billion per year in just 2030 alone. So there's a big difference between the CBO saying 3.2 over 10 years and 17 billion in 1 year that was used to justify the climate benefits of this proposal. Someone's wrong. I don't know who it is. It could be both are wrong. And it could be both are wrong by a lot, because if you look at the maximum benefit that could be offered, if all of the facilities that are emitting CO2 were to capture their CO2 and push for this credit, we're looking at $283 billion to $401 billion per year, depending on the credit that they would capture, be it through enhanced oil recovery or for geological storage. So potentially trillions of dollars in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry for 45Q, but really an endless pot of money, a slush fund for them to use to profit off of this technology that doesn't work and isn't effective at actually addressing the climate crisis. And what's really important is this was done despite 2 recent investigations that were done by the federal government. A Treasury Department Inspector General investigation found that 1 billion in 45Q credits had been improperly claimed. And so the IRS, how this works is a company will basically file their taxes. And when they file their tax with the IRS, they say, we're claiming these credits, and then the IRS balances it out and pays them, or they pay whatever it is that they're supposed to pay in taxes. A lot of these guys don't pay any taxes, but regardless, that's how it's supposed to work out. Turns out that the Treasury Department Inspector General found out that there had been no verification of CO2, which is required under the law, that they're actually supposed to report this information to EPA and have their storage verified. Never happened. They still got paid. They still kept the money. And there's been no verification whatsoever, as far as anyone can tell, that the EPA has actually verified that this happened. The General Accounting Office has also raised critical concerns of Department of Energy's management of CCS projects. And in doing this, they actually found that the DOE uses an expedited review process that essentially allowed them to quickly evaluate projects and pick them, and then without going through a full process of how projects have typically picked. And they also, when these projects were running over costs, they bypassed cost controls to continue diverting money to failing projects. And it resulted in $472 million being spent on facilities that were never built, which is 300 more than was actually supposed to be spent on these facilities to begin with. And so we've seen massive abuse and misuse of resources and mismanagement and lack of federal oversight of carbon capture resources to this industry that we've just essentially given a blank check to. And And to make things worse, there's a piece of legislation that is tacking now that is that was negotiated between Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer to that will fast track a number of fossil fuel projects. And what this legislation does is it actually would change the National Environmental Policy Act and the Clean Water Act, and which are bedrock public health and environmental laws that communities can use to make sure that their air, communities, farms are protected from these projects. And you evaluate projects under NEPA, you look at them, you understand the impacts of them, and then determine if there's harms. And if there's harms, you try to find ways to mitigate those harms. And if you can't mitigate those harms, then sometimes projects don't get built because of the harms they cause. And so the industry is actually now working to eliminate those sorts of roadblocks that they see to building their projects. And in doing this legislation would actually force the administration to pick a minimum of 2 carbon capture projects and 1 hydrogen project that would be of strategic national importance, which would get special priority for permitting to speed up the process. There's also a limit to NEPA projects for 1 to 2 years, depending on the type of review and analysis that goes on. And so if the project is not finished in 2 years, it would be permitted. If the federal agency hasn't yet rejected that project from going forward. And then it also says a maximum of 60 days for public comments unless a developer agrees to go longer. And this is important because you look at the pipelines that are being planned across the Midwest. We know these companies have been planning these pipelines for years, studying and evaluating and looking at the impacts and what they want to do and where they want to do it and why. The public doesn't have access to all of those things. We're struggling to figure out exactly where the pipelines are going to go and how they're going to go in many places, what streams they're going to cross and the impacts they'll have on that. The public will only have 60 days once they find out the official project to actually figure out those things and comment, where the industry's had years to look at and evaluate these things. And the only way the public can get longer than 60 days is if the project developer agrees for it to go longer than 60 days. Do you think a pipeline company is going to agree to give the public a longer period of time to comment on something? Probably not. It also changes how the courts look at these things. And so when we look at these projects, one of the reasons they take a long time, and particularly for fossil fuel projects, is because the project developers try to pretend like oil pipelines aren't going to spill oil all over the place. They try to pretend like gas pipelines aren't going to result in climate impacts. And lawyers for Food and Water Watch and other organizations challenge these projects and go to the courts, and the judges look at them and say, yeah, federal agency, you shouldn't have approved this permit. You shouldn't have allowed this to go forward. We are going to force you to go back to the drawing board and put together a new plan. And so that takes time then to go back to those things. We've also seen that these projects are being delayed delayed because of lack of funding. So some projects where the project developers run out of money and they don't have the resources to carry them out. So they put the projects on hold for a number of years while they resecure financing. So these timelines can be extended for the developers, but not the rest of us. And then when you go to the courts and challenge these decisions, you only have 6 months to actually challenge the decisions, as opposed to a number of years under current law. So if you don't bring a challenge within 6 months, then you cannot, you lose your right and ability to challenge these decisions, which is very concerning, because if you think about all the complexities of laws and pipelines and what goes on, that timeline is pretty short to be able to bring up some of these challenges to these pipeline decisions. And then they also create a panel of judges in the appellate court. So when you appeal a project, you go in front of judges, and those judges will rule on a project. And what this would do is actually change out judges. So if you go before a judge and that judge says, nope, go back to the drawing board, and then you bring it back, you get a new panel of judges. And this generally assumes that, the judge must have been biased, and that's why they didn't support this. And so now we're going to put it in front of another judge. So they're essentially shopping judges around until they get a judge that they want that's friendly to their projects. And so this will dramatically undermine public health and environmental laws. this is being attached, this bill right here, the dirty deal. Senator Schumer is talking about attaching this to the continuing resolution, which is a bill that will fund the government. The federal government gets funded every year from October 1st through September 30th. And the Congress has to pass a new budget and a new appropriation every year to keep the federal government open. And so if they don't pass a federal budget, then the federal government shuts down. And so Schumer is saying that he will attach this bill to the continuing resolution so that if people do not vote for this, they are voting to shut down the government, a very unpopular thing to do. And so we need to make it more unpopular for them to do this, because the tools that we will use to fight these pipelines in Iowa and everywhere else are in NEPA. They are in the Clean Water Act, and the industry is trying to take that away from us right now, to take those tools away from us to be able to fight these things going forward. And so I will, with that, I guess we'll open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. I know I saw a couple in the chat. So Cindy asked, when will they announce which CCS projects are getting fast tracked? And I think, Jim, that depends on if this side deal is approved, right? But do we have a timeline, hypothetically, if it is approved?
Yeah, so if it is approved, I believe that, so one is, we only have seen draft legislation. And so this is very important, that was leaked. And that legislation actually had a watermark stamped on it of draft-API, which likely stands for the American Petroleum Institute, who clearly, they're the lobbying group for the fossil fuel industry and clearly has their fingerprints all over this, literally with their watermark on there. And the administration will actually have to identify 25 high priority projects. I believe they have 90 days to identify those projects that will be the high priority projects for each of the fossil fuel projects. But it depends on what the final legislation says. We may not see that legislation until a couple of days before the federal government shuts down. There's speculation that it might be released later this week or potentially next week. We're going to fight really hard to make sure we never get to that point. But it very, very likely that that they would have to come out with something sometime by early next year of a list of priority projects.
Perfect. Susie, you radical, you asked, wouldn't it be better economics for the government to buy out the oil and gas companies, to nationalize it, and also be environmentally wiser? Jim, you have comments on that one?
Yes.
Good answer. Short, succinct. That's what we like to hear.
No, it's absolutely right. There's, we should not have a profit incentive for people to destroy our planet. And that's what this carbon capture subsidy does. And it's a waste of money. And utilities for energy should be run and owned by the public. And we are seeing now the problems with this. And I think the thing that's also important, we're seeing billions, records profits for oil and gas industry. They're using that for stock buybacks. They're using that to enrich themselves, when we could actually be using that money, if it was nationalized, to actually support transition programs to help workers move into new careers and new areas outside of this, to support communities transitioning and making investments in communities to help them transition off of fossil fuel infrastructure, both for jobs and also in our homes, and to switching over from gas water heaters and things like that. So absolutely, it'd be a much, much better thing to do. So yes.
Awesome. Greg asked if you could explain how the Iowa carbon capture projects say they will sell ethanol to California or get credits from ethanol. I know you can answer this one.
Sure. So that's a whole nother set of subsidies that exist. And so what the person's asking about is this program called the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, as well as the California Cap and Trade program. And both of those policies in the state of California allow companies to within California. It requires the certain polluters to put a cap on how many emissions that they're going to spew out in the atmosphere. And if they can't meet that, or they could meet them, but they could decide, well, we're going to buy credits elsewhere. So the idea is that, oh, well, if somebody else is reducing emissions, then we can continue to emit as long as we pay them for their reduction in emissions, and you get a credit for doing that. And so what the Iowa pipeline companies are planning to do, as well as other carbon capture entities are looking to do, is to actually sell credits into the California carbon market, so that polluters there will actually pay them for the capturing of CO2, in addition to the 45Q tax credits. And that's a whole nother scheme that goes on. It also, that same program supports factory farms getting money for biogas digesters, another scam that's being brought out there. And then the ethanol subsidies, they already receive ethanol subsidies through the carbon capture, through the California low carbon fuel standard. If they, there's certain requirements that ethanol be used within California, and there's ways that even if it's not used in California, it can kind of look like it's used in California. So, so some of these facilities might actually already be getting credits through that, even without the carbon capture going forward through the low carbon fuel standard. But it's essentially, it's a cap and trade program that allows polluters to buy credits from other people for reducing their emissions.
Perfect. I like how, Marianne, we were just talking about the Mountain Valley pipeline, and there are a lot of similarities, I feel like, between Mountain Valley and what we're facing, and just, I think, what we can potentially expect. Debbie asked, when you say geologic storage, does that mean fracking? Jim, you want to explain that a little bit more?
Geological storage does not mean fracking, but it sounds nice. So geological storage is the general idea that we can take CO2 and inject it into the earth and forget about it, and it'll be permanently down there forever. That doesn't actually happen, and there's a lot of questions and concerns related to the ability to do that and to safely and permanently store CO2 in the earth. Under 45Q, they're only required, which we talked about earlier, they're not actually meeting these requirements, but they only have to verify it for 3 years, and then it's assumed to be permanent. And with geological storage, what they'll do is they'll take the CO2 and they'll usually pump, what they would want to do with it is pump it into a saltwater aquifer. And these saltwater aquifers can actually then, the water in those aquifers can become more acidic because of CO2 entering that water, which can also then create chemical reactions with rocks and other structures under the earth that can cause new cracks or fissures in the surface to emerge, where they're looking at using geological storage in some areas where oil and gas drilling is going on, or this enhanced oil recovery. It's possible that you could have geological storage in those areas. And if there are fracking wells nearby, it's possible that a fracking well may open up a new fissure that would cause the CO2 to leak uncontrollably from these sources. And a perfect example of this happened in California, where a gas storage facility there called Aliso Canyon was actually storing methane. But that facility was leaking uncontrollably for months, and they were unable to patch the leak. And so what we're doing through talking about geological storage of CO2 is creating an entire network of Aliso canyons around the country that could leak uncontrollably these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And this is very concerning, because one, it's, the droughts and fires and things like that, but also the fact that a lot of these companies then will get credits in the low carbon fuel standard. They'll get credits for the federal government for capturing these things, but there'll be no accountability to them in the long run when these things happen. And those costs very well could be borne by the taxpayers to actually deal with fixing these leaks and making sure that they stop.
Right.
Oh, one other thing on geological storage I want to bring up too, this is really important, it isn't talked about much, is that with geological storage, when you inject it into saltwater aquifer, you actually need to create space for the CO2 to go in there. And so the salt water in these operations will need, some of the salt water will need to come out. And when the salt water comes out, in the same way we've actually seen fracking waste come back up with radioactive elements in it, there's concerns that that waste from the salt, these aquifers may also come up with radioactive elements, because what happens is this water will travel thousands of feet through the Earth's surface, and where there are naturally occurring radioactive elements, heavy metals, and other harmful things that will all come back up with the wastewater. And there's concerns about, well, what do we do now with this new pool of radioactive waste? And we've seen through amazing coverage that Rolling Stone did that we're actually seeing that some of this radioactive waste from fracking operations is being spread on roadways, being used in pool salts, and creating massive hazards across our country because of improper handling of radioactive waste from these fracking operations, and could potentially also happen with these CO2 storage facilities as well.
I personally love when my swimming pool comes with a little side of radioactive waste, but maybe that's just me. No. Claudia asked if Summit is proposing geologic storage in central Illinois. So that's actually Navigator and ADM Wolf. Their pipelines will be going to central Illinois. Summit is going to be going up to North Dakota into the Bakken region. And Greg has a follow-up about what you said on California. It sounds like you're saying the Iowa ethanol companies can say they're supplying their ethanol to California when they actually aren't. They can make it look like they're selling it there, but they aren't. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's the general idea that they don't actually have to sell the ethanol into California's market, but be used by California in some way. So it could potentially be somebody else who's selling it into there, and then you were able to, provide them with ethanol, so that they could meet their needs outside of California, despite the ethanol being sold into California. There's also, but it's not that they're gaming the system, it's that the system itself is gamed to begin with.
Perfect. Probably have time for one more question, if any. Okay, there we go. So will CO2 coming from North Dakota and Summit pipeline likely be contaminated with hydrogen sulfide and methane too? So what we're hearing at this point, at least, is that the carbon that they're transporting is going to be a relatively pure form. We're trying to get them to actually give us precise numbers. We haven't seen that yet, but like what we saw in Satarsha, Mississippi, when a pipeline ruptured down there a while back, one of the things that was actually in some ways helpful was that it had hydrogen sulfide in it, and so it created like a rotten egg smell, and so people were able to tell that something wasn't right. They could smell the gas, whereas if these pipeline companies, like they're saying to us right now in Iowa, are actually adding any type of odorant, we're never going to know if there is a pipeline leak, if we're about to be asphyxiated by carbon, because there aren't going to be any real warning signs. Cool. Any last minute thoughts, Jim?
I just want to thank everybody for joining this webinar and taking time to learn about these projects. I encourage you to continue fighting this. I think that sometimes it can feel hard when you see what we're up against in these massive special interests that are pushing these things. But we are making progress. The fact that they are pushing this federal legislation to roll back these standards is because of the hard work that people have been putting forward to fight these pipelines on the ground around the country. And so we need to keep fighting, and we need to keep pushing, because one of the things I've learned from this is, as bad as the climate crisis is, and it's bad, and we're in the throes of it, every degree of warming matters. And that means that every project we're able to stop matters. Every day we're able to delay these projects matter to helping stop future warming and helping make sure that these things don't continue to get worse. And for those of you whose homes are in the front lines of this, I thank you for the struggle that you're going through right now. I just heard really compelling stories of people that are suffering from the Mountain Valley pipeline that's being built. And so I'm sorry that this is come down on you, and we're here to stand with you and fight with you against these projects, both to protect your communities and homes, but also to protect our planet as well. So thank you so much for standing with us.
it, Jim, that was too profound. Now I feel like I have other things to touch on really quick, but that was such a good note. We should just wrap her up. Thanks a lot. Making me look like the bad guy here. No, but really, thank you. That was, yeah, very powerful and very true. Really quick, I just did want to touch on one thing that kind of goes into all of this. So like Jim explained earlier, is that CCS is really only possible because of the massive government funding streams that are going on right now. And that's why I think it's important to just really quickly note that the role of lobbying and campaign contributions within this scheme. So for example, Navigator has spent $760,000 lobbying members of Congress since last October. $760,000, which, I mean, of course, when they stand to make billions of dollars from their proposed carbon pipeline scam is really just pocket change, I guess. But they've admitted that they're up there lobbying on issues like strengthening 45Q for their own benefit. So we really are up against these just monumental forces in this fight. Another example, Bruce Rostetter, the man behind Summit Carbon Solutions, has spent over $2 million influencing our elected officials in his lifetime. On the state legislative level, these companies have racked up the most in Iowa during the legislative session, spending $92,600 in just a handful of months to ensure that our elected officials did not hinder their projects. And frankly, they succeeded in the last legislative session, which means we have to work even harder coming up in the next few months to make sure that they don't succeed again, because we're running out of time here. I also don't think it's surprising to anyone on our side here that we don't have billions of dollars to throw around like these companies do. I mean, honestly, where is George Soros when you need him, right? But that's not going to stop us, because we have something that's even more important, and that's people power. Individually, the things I do or the things that you do may not have a major impact, but united, what we do together will create change. So we can and we will stop these pipeline scams so long as we keep working together and bringing others along towards our shared goal. And with that, before everybody skedaddles, I do want to share just a few action steps that you can take coming out of tonight's event. So first up, if you haven't noticed, there are elections coming up very soon, November 8th. Don't forget to vote. But that means right now is the time to be getting your elected officials and candidates at all levels, from Congress to supervisors and commissioners, on the record about where they stand on carbon pipelines and CCS. Attend their town halls, their forums, their campaign events, all of it. Share your views and ask them where they stand. We have to make sure that they're hearing about this issue from us, because otherwise, the only people that are talking to them about it are industry insiders and their lobbyists, who are only sharing one side of the story. And we're also asking people across the country to deliver a letter to their representative opposing the Mansion side deal that Jim mentioned. This is something that needs to be done sooner rather than later, but fortunately for you, we have a step-by-step instruction guide along with a customizable letter already set up. We'll put the link to the instructions in the chat, as well as include it in the follow-up email tomorrow, but you can always reach out if you have any questions. And of course, there are a number of other ways to get involved, with new opportunities popping up every day. So keep an eye on our social media, and like I said, reach out anytime with questions, ideas, secrets, confessions, gossip, whatever. I will pop my email in the chat so it's available, but you'll also be getting an email from me tomorrow with a recording of the webinar and other follow-up information. So you'll have it regardless. So with that, unless anybody has some good gossip or dark confessions to share with us all right now, we can call it a night. So thanks again to all of you for coming. Thanks to Jim for joining us, John, the Yellowstone super volcano for not exploding and ruining all of our internet connections. Really appreciate it. Did us good. And we'll talk soon. Thanks.